Okay, well, it's 1:30, so we in Geneva anyway. I'm sure it's different times in different parts of the world. So we shall start. Welcome everybody to our Climate Future Series webinar, the Rise of Geoengineering and its potential impacts for the humanitarian sector. We're extremely excited today to have two very high profile and eminent guest speakers. We look forward to hearing their views on this and to having a discussion on this important subject as well. You will just a couple of items for us to keep in mind as we're going. You can ask questions of our speakers. You can type them into the message box, which is towards the bottom of your screen or down underneath the main picture screen of this webinar. You can type those in and send those anytime you want. We will keep them aside and put them to our speakers towards the end of the webinar. So feel free to send your questions as you hear things and want to put them in, and we'll try and get back to them depending on how many questions we get, of course. Okay, so as I said, we're very excited to be able to present this webinar today. We've got it's a really important subject, and it's something that probably a lot of us don't really know a lot about. Some of us will know more about it, but our speakers today know a lot about it, so we're looking forward to hearing from them. Our first speaker for the day is going to be Dr. Pablo Suarez. He's leading the research and innovation functions within the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre. Pablo will be known to many of you. You may have run into him around in the network at various points, and no doubt you've probably played games with him as well, since he really likes doing that. Our second speaker after Pablo is Dr. David Keith, and we're very happy to welcome Dr. Keith here today. He's a professor of applied physics in Harvard School of Engineering, but is really on the forefront of a lot of climate science and energy technology, and we're looking forward to hearing from him in a little while. But first we're going to hear from Pablo Suarez, and I will hand it over to him in a minute. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the message box. Enjoy Pablo's presentation. We are recording this, so if you miss parts of it, then we can we'll be distributing it again afterwards. So we'll hand it over to Pablo. He'll do his part, and then we'll go to Dr. Keith, and then after that we'll have time for discussion and questions. So thank you again very much for joining today. We hope you enjoy it, and we will talk to you again in a minute. And Pablo, over to you.
Hello everyone. It takes some time to take the technology forward. And now we are ready to dive in for this first ever geoengineering webinar convened by the Federation. Thank you so much, Sean and the Solferino Academy team, for making this happen. Carlos, if you can advance to the next slide, please. Assuming you can see this image, it's a Red Cross Red Crescent vehicle on a very sunny day, with a driver being trained on how to take this technological device through unusual terrain. And that's a little bit what we're doing. For those of you who have experienced a vehicle in the sunlight, if you are mandated to be inside the vehicle with your windows closed on a sunny day, we all know what is likely to happen. The sunlight comes in through the windshield, through the transparent glass, the interior heats up. Some of that heat can go away through the glass, but some remains trapped. If it is there for a long while, it can get really hot. One option is to open the window. Should you be unable to open the window, you can try to block sunlight, for example, by moving that rack on the roof, pushing it forward so you block some of the sunlight. What we're going to talk about today is something like that management of temperature in an enclosed space that is not a vehicle, but it's our planet. So moving on, please, Carlos, to the next one. Geoengineering is one of the many terms that have been used, including climate engineering, solar radiation management, and a few others, to refer to the deliberate manipulation of the global climate, the intentional change of our planet's atmospheric conditions with the intent of moderating global warming. Carlos, if you can please advance. Exactly, thank you. This is one of the definitions. You can see the metaphor of a big wrench holding the planet. We know that as of now, there is essentially no framework, no legal regulatory framework to prevent this from happening, should a nation or a set of nation states or an individual with a lot of money and access to technology want to do it. It is important to bear in mind, and I will get more into the details soon, but it is roughly as cheap or cheaper than a nuclear weapon to give it a try. And we know that there are several countries, including not exactly very wealthy countries, that have had access to technology like nuclear weapons. The next text says that this is an impression. Oops, can you go up? Thank you. It is probable that in our lifetime, if we live another 20 to 50 years, it is possible that the planet's climate will be deliberately changed. This is particularly true should we enter what some people refer to as runaway climate change scenario, where things go completely out of whack with sea level, with the melting of the Arctic, with extreme events. Or maybe all it takes is some kind of crisis triggering heroic attempts by people or teams who can do it. Moving on, in the next slide, you will see a simplified representation of our planet and its atmosphere. Just like with the Red Cross vehicle, the atmosphere is a transparent membrane that lets sunlight come in. It heats where we live, the oceans, the land, the air, and some of that heat goes away through the atmosphere, some gets trapped, and that's why we're comfortable in our planet. What we have been doing in the last couple centuries has been to take carbon, coal, oil, gas from under the crust of the earth, burn it for fuels, for using energy, and in doing that we have changed the atmospheric chemistry, the atmospheric composition of our planet, and as a result it's as if that glass had become thicker. So moving, if you click once again, you will see a reference to GHG, or greenhouse gases. If we put more of those in the atmosphere, we trap more of the solar energy that comes in the form of sunshine. One form of geoengineering that has been proposed is to undo that. If we click again, you will see a term referring to carbon capture and sequestration. It's essentially sucking some of this carbon from the atmosphere, just like plants and trees do. And as a result, there will be less of this stuff up in the air, and then our planet will gradually, slowly trap less of that incoming energy. This is generally understood to be rather expensive and rather slow in its impacts. There's another way to conceive geoengineering, and that is, imagine that we have a gigantic umbrella blocking sunlight. That is technically very difficult, but it's much easier to have many, many, many tiny umbrellas, which if you click, you can see a little simplified representation. If we do as volcanic eruptions do occasionally, they put up in the upper atmosphere, above where airplanes fly, lots of tiny particles that reflect some of the incoming sunlight. Solar radiation management would reflect more of that sunlight, and as a result cast tiny shadows that can cool down the planet. In the past, the planet has cooled down between 0.5 degree and 2 degrees on average globally for months or up to 2 years. So we know from the historical record, as recently as 1991, when Mount Pinatubo erupted, that this works. If you block sunlight, the planet gets colder. Proponents of solar radiation management, proponents of geoengineering, argue convincingly that if it gets too hot, we block sunlight, and we reverse the accumulation of heat in our planet. Some have portrayed this, and we can move on, as a potential emergency procedure. This is from Eli Kintish. He made a little emergency card of the type that you can find on airplanes, referring to emergency procedures for planet Earth. If we click again, we will see one of his images, which is essentially you have to look out and you push a button and some pipes go out and your plane starts spraying these sulfur-rich, sulfur particles or other small particles that reflect sunlight. And of course, these would successfully cool down the planet a little bit. It could also do some other things. Many people who are not very familiar with this topic are concerned about the chemical or environmental consequences of having sulfuric particles or other particles added by us as a form of pollution. It turns out that the impact of those particles from a chemical perspective would not be so relevant to us in terms of polluting water and the like. The main issue is that in blocking sunlight, not only the average temperature goes down, but also this would have an impact on how winds, ocean currents, and other systems in our planet move air, water, heat around. So there are expected to be changes not only at the global, but also at the regional level. Moving on, you will see that the Climate Center has been engaged for a while. The director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, Martin van Alst, was a doctoral student of Mr. Paul Crutzen, who won a Nobel Prize, and in 2006 said, you know what, given what's going on, we may need to start doing this thing. That gave a different level of prominence. Since 2009, I and Jano, also from the Climate Center, have been engaging a Silomar conference and a documentary and a paper, and Martin spoke to the UK Parliament and publications. In the Philippines, our colleague Donna received the team from David Keith from Harvard University talking about potential consequences, desired and undesired, in terms of agriculture. And just yesterday, a few important things happened, including the launch of C2G2, which is a roughly $4 million initiative for talking or discussing or exploring geoengineering governance. If you click again, you will see a few benefits that the Climate Center has derived from this, not only in terms of learning and policy, but also, for example, a direct connection to one of the editors of The Economist, Oliver Morton, who now asks the Climate Center about humanitarian consequences of phenomena that range from El Nino to volcanic eruptions. And the last photo, for those of you who were in the UN Climate Conference in Lima, we collaborated with artist Tomas Saraceno, who is now in conversations with IFRC and ASI about bringing art to raise awareness. All of these are connections derived from the very interesting persons and institutions that are part of the geoengineering debate. Moving forward, we are now trying to prepare as Climate Center a working paper for humanitarians to understand the issue of geoengineering, and we are wondering what is the year in the future where geoengineering technology may be deployed. It may be never, it may be in our lifetime, or it may be very, very soon. Unlikely technologically, it's not likely to happen in 5 to 20 years, but it suddenly has become within the foreseeable future as a technical and geopolitical possibility. This, of course, is very relevant to us. If we move on, in the next slide, you will see one of the early computer simulations of changing climate conditions. The top one, if you click, refers to a scenario where there is climate change without any attempt to block sunlight. The blue means more extreme temperature, the red means, more rainfall on an annual anomaly basis. The red means less. In the top, you see that if you don't block sunlight, according to this model, large parts of the planet are affected. In the bottom one, the computer examines what happens if the climate continues to change, but you also have humans blocking sunlight, and many parts of the world experience less change. Now, if we click again once, I want to point out to a part of West Africa, including Gabon, where it turns out that blocking sunlight makes matters a little worse. So let's imagine that 100 countries are better off, but Gabon and 2 other countries are worse off. What happens to that country? That's one of the things that we first thought about when we were thinking about the potential consequences of geoengineering. We may have, assuming the models are correct, which is a big assumption because there's so many things we don't know about the climate system. But if someone gets worse off, what does it mean for the humanitarian sector? Moving on to the next slide. One of the geoengineering questions is how to deal with specific locations. In 2010, yes, moving on, thank you, Carlos. In the next slide, 2 questions that we posed at the Asilomar conference, which was one of the first big events on this, where I was invited as a presenter. And I must say, the community of proponents, explorers, discussants of this topic have been extremely open and very proactively inviting both the humanitarian sector and people from developing countries. Not surprisingly, it's not easy to engage them because of the technical nature of this, the long-term nature of this. 2 questions we posed in 2010. If you can click twice, Carlos. One is, how will the most vulnerable people in this planet help to make geoengineering decisions? Yes, do it, or no, don't do it, and if yes, how? Of course, the default assumption is that people like the gentleman depicted in the photo will not play a role in making decisions, even though those decisions would affect him or her. The second question is, in a geoengineered planet, who will pay for humanitarian work? We know from other fields that sometimes if a system is disrupted by one agent, others think that, okay, it's no longer my problem. One of the early proposals we made in a paper with Jano and another colleague, if you click please, is how are we going to ensure that researching the probable impacts on the most vulnerable merits as much attention and funding and publications and analysis and exploration of possible mitigating actions as the likely net benefits for the planet or for those funding the research. It is crucial that we engage with the most vulnerable as the lens of our discussion. Moving on, this is a paper that was just published yesterday, co-authored by myself and Martin van Aalst in the journal Earth's Future, where we posit geoengineering as a humanitarian concern. We now think that the rate of change in the technology and the geopolitics merits our awareness and to some extent our engagement. We may be in a similar place as we were about 12-15 years ago when the Climate Center began to exist and started speaking of climate change not only as a scientific problem or an environmental problem for polar bears, but also a humanitarian issue. 4 or 5 key points from this paper just published, and I encourage anyone who is curious to look for it. Geoengineering, a humanitarian concern, Earth's future. Moving on to the next one. The first point is that whether or not geoengineering is deployed in the context of changing climate, there are major implications for the most vulnerable and for impacts on the most vulnerable. We know that just a conversation about geoengineering changes the nature of the debate. And it is important for us to be engaged, because whether or not it happens and when someone proposes to do it, there will not be many voices saying, what will happen to sub-Saharan Africa? What may this mean for subsistence farmers, fishermen, coastal residents, urban informal settlement dwellers, and so on? A second point we make in that paper is that, if we move on, Carlos, please, no one likes to be a rat in someone else's laboratory. And this is a planetary experiment we're already doing with climate change. Of course, climate change is the unwanted side effect of development. But when someone begins to propose to change atmospheric chemistry for deliberately changing the climate, we all become the laboratories of an experiment. And it may be what happens. We want to try to see how we play a role. Next point, please. We did refer to the potentially delusional assumptions of rationality in decision making. Many scientists who have been examining this issue have been saying, well, the reasonable thing to do would be, for example, to consider deploying geoengineering under certain circumstances for certain objectives. And while, of course, that is one potential way forward, there is also other potential motivations that will be less based on reason and more based on anything from selfish behavior to uninformed temperamental decisions. A last point we make, which is probably the most relevant, is that we borrow an idea from Hugo Slim from the ICRC and adapt it to refer to predatory geoengineering, the technologically feasible possibility of intentionally changing the climate for reducing impacts on oneself, a place, a country, a region, a sector, knowing that it may cause damage to others. So predatory behavior to, for example, grab rainfall from the intertropical convergence zone and make one place better in terms of rainfall while making some other place worse off. This, of course, can have enormous geopolitical implications, the threat of conflict and so on. Very quickly, last few slides. If you click again, Carlos, please. People are talking of cloudscapes, manipulative atmospheric behavior. Who's going to put the hand of the thermostat? What research and governance? What if someone or some state or set of actors thinks of deployment as imminent? What does it all mean for the Red Cross, Red Crescent family, for humanitarians? We don't know. We have to think hard. These are very difficult questions. Next, you will see the cover of one recent book by Oliver Morton, The Planet Remade. There is a challenge in the deliberate manipulation, and this book provides very interesting insights on the science, the politics, what can happen, how could we do it well. Another book, also very prominent, by Naomi Klein, about climate with a much more activist perspective from the left side. She has a full chapter dedicated to geoengineering, and of course it is very much on a different perspective, saying a lot of things can go wrong, a lot of things will go wrong, decision making, capitalism, and so on. Next slide, please. If you want to get a flavor of the extent to which this gets visceral attacks, there is a group called ETC Group that has published Geopiracy, the case against geoengineering, loud and clear messages. And on the other end of the spectrum, there is the case for climate engineering, published by David Keith, our next speaker at Harvard University. And as we lead the way for David to share with us his insights, it's very important to note that he has been perhaps the most prominent and respected, not necessarily proponent of geoengineering, but proponent of thinking seriously about this. Bill Gates is one of the people who listens to him. He has already successfully fundraised millions of dollars for the exploration of this issue. And just yesterday, he shared with us at a meeting that he has inked some paperwork for the purposes of doing, as far as I know, the first ever actual field experiment of putting a small amount of small particles in the upper atmosphere and measuring what happens to better understand what may be the implications of doing this. This is a momentous moment, very rapid change. The meeting yesterday was a meeting as part of a dialogue process on geoengineering governance that has received $4 million just to talk about these things. So as you can imagine, the planet can get remade, and it's time for us to think about it. I'd like to invite David, who, by the way, has been a great debater, and we have had locking horns and entertaining conversations. David, you're welcome to refute or complement anything I have said, as well as, of course, sharing your insights. We're particularly interested in what you think the Red Cross Red Crescent family should be thinking about this topic. Thank you all.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Should we use video or not?
Probably not a good idea because many of our colleagues have bad internet connections, unless you need it. I'll let the team decide.
I'll turn it off. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. I guess I'd like to start out by giving a kind of very short version of my view and to really ask some questions about the kind of perspective that Pablo offered, because I think in some deep way I don't understand that. I respect Pablo and enjoy him enormously, but I don't in some ways understand the choices he's making about this and the way it's represented outside as a choice by the RC community. So I think that's kind of where I want to go. Maybe the first statement is I am a professor of physics, but also actually of public policy, and all the things I have to say are really about public policy. And I think it's important to say that Pablo kind of wanted to draw this distinction between, you know, naive scientists who don't get public policy and think people are rational, and people who have a more activist perspective. And I guess that doesn't feel like me. I think that I was among the first, perhaps the first person to raise these questions about justice and international conflict in papers in the early 90s. And I don't expect people to behave rationally, and I think that these issues of power, questions about who wins and who loses, who gets to make the decisions, are the central questions. So I completely agree. What I want you to tune into is that Pablo, as many others, are painting a picture which is a caricature and not maybe that accurate a picture of the debate that's in fact going on. My view is that deploying these technologies now would be wildly inappropriate, just crazy. I think there is evidence that these solar geoengineering technologies could substantially reduce impacts, particularly to the most vulnerable, which is in fact something we've studied explicitly and we'll tell you about. But that evidence is just suggestive. At this point, there isn't a substantial research effort, and I think it would be wildly irresponsible to advocate deployment. What I do advocate strongly is that we need to know more, that it would be healthy to have a substantial international open access research program that really can inform publicly decisions that will get made around the world. There's no obvious one decision-making body. It's a complicated, multipolar world that will inform decisions about this technology decade or two in the future. And that research should aim to understand the risks of these technologies, how well they would work, how effective they are, and in particular how effective they are on dealing with extreme events and on dealing with the events that fall hardest on the most vulnerable. So that's essentially what I think is that we ought to have a real research program. And I think it's important to say that there are many people who you know, some people who Pablo cites are not just critics of deployment, but they're actively opposed to a research program. And the words and the way that Pablo talks about it, I think, are interpreted and used by people who believe that we should not have a research program. That's a valid belief, but we've got to be clear-eyed about what its consequences are. And the consequences are that we'll make decisions with less information in the future. So my basic view is this technology is at best a supplement to cutting emissions. emissions. In the end, if you want a stable climate to reduce climate risk, we must bring emissions to zero. But it may be a useful supplement to emissions cuts, not a substitute. And it reduces climate risk, not just changes in temperature, but changes in a variety of the key climate variables that have impacts on humans and the natural world. The evidence from a suite of climate models, all the standard climate models that are used to generate really the core of all our information about climate, I think suggest very strongly, it's very hard to show counterexamples, that if you do moderate geoengineering, using it to say prevent the increase in net precipitation, not using it to return to pre-industrial, as was in the early figure that was shown to you by Pablo, that almost all regions have less change in temperature and say soil moisture and extreme events than they would in the world with the same amount of carbon dioxide but no solar geoengineering, and that the level of remaining kind of inequality is in fact smaller than the equivalent inequality from climate change, which isn't to say it doesn't matter, but it is important to be quantitative about it. So any large policy of any kind has some winners and losers. That's just the reality. It's true also of policies to restrict emissions. I'm entirely in favor of restricting emissions, but people will suffer when we do that. I finally want to pick up on language a little bit. So Pablo compared this to nuclear weapons, and I made that comparison too. I mean, there's some ways in which it's fair. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a choice, and it's a choice that in some ways is spin. Another way to compare it is to vaccines, and in some ways that's more relevant in terms of the potential ratios of cost to human benefits. A lot of other comparisons you could choose. These are all just words, but the choice of words matters. Nuclear weapons are designed to burn people alive. These technologies, are at least in the minds of my own mind and the minds of most other people I know working on them, are designed to reduce the harms to some of the more vulnerable people on the planet who will be suffering from heat waves and extreme events like tropical cyclones. That's not to say there are no issues or that these issues of governance are not real. They absolutely are. But the choice of language matters and influences the way the debate works. Pablo mentioned again in the sort of how it would be implemented that it might be in a time of crisis and a single actor or a rich person. These are possible outcomes. I personally think the idea of using this in this kind of emergency mode makes little sense. I can't imagine I personally would support it, but again, the only thing I support now is just us learning more about it. But it's important to say there are other scenarios, and the choice of scenarios that Pablo's presented here paints a particular picture. Other scenarios are that in fact this is done by a coalition of poor countries, the most vulnerable, that have the largest role in deciding it. Because in some ways it's a kind of democratizing technology because it's cheap, and because those countries stand the most to gain by reducing the direct harms to their populations. Maybe that's sort of as a core of some of the things that I want to say, and really, I think this isn't so much. I think to be clear what we agree about. We agree that what matters is one of the central things that should matter is risks to the more vulnerable, and that questions about who decides are central, and that in really no circumstance will people like the man in Pablo's final picture be making the decisions. That's sadly not the way the world works really for anything. But I think we could arrange it, and there may be ways where these technologies, where decisions about these technologies can be made in ways that have some level of real legitimacy and democracy. Not perfect, because there is no such thing, but ways that are comparatively more fair and legitimate than decisions about CO2 emissions. And to just maybe end with some particular sort of few technical tidbits. The evidence is, I think, very strong from a suite of climate models, and I can't really think of a paper that shows a counter example, but I may be wrong, that these technologies are particularly effective, solar geoengineering, in reducing extreme events. We have just, for example, worked with the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab that has maybe the best model looking at tropical cyclones. And it's early, just paper's not even published. It was presented all publicly at American Geophysical Union, but it fits with other things we've seen. It looks like the effect of this, of moderate solar geoengineering in reducing tropical cyclone intensity is much stronger than the effect in reducing temperature. So that a moderate amount of solar geoengineering actually reduces in that model, and it might not be true in other models, but that's about sort of the state of the art for tropical cyclones, reduces tropical cyclone intensity basically back to pre-industrial. And we've also been looking carefully, and Pablo, was pointing out that it's really important that researchers look at the vulnerable, but we've been doing that. There's a lot of evidence that a big chunk of climate impacts is just simply to do with extreme temperatures. And so we've been doing some analysis both of how temperature extremes respond, but also using econometric analysis to understand how those risks are distributed by across wealth. So far, we're doing it for the U.S. We'd like to do it globally, but in the U.S., and I think it would be sort of this actually more true globally, it is pretty clear that it's the poorest who benefit the most, basically because they have the highest impacts from high temperature extremes. So I guess I'd like to get a conversation going back and forth. I think again, I completely agree that questions about who decides, what the decision sort of rules are most important. I agree it's absurd to think there's some kind of rational, cold calculation under which this is done, but precisely because I take the public policy and language seriously, I'd like to understand from Pablo why he's making the choices to present it that way, given what I see, but maybe he doesn't, as the evidence from the research community so far that these technologies could substantially reduce the kind of humanitarian risk that Red Cross Red Crescent works on. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So while I complement, respond, and invite additional comments on David's remarks, I'd like to invite everyone who is part of this webinar, if you want to just write one line with two things. One is the location where you happen to be right now as you listen to this webinar, and another is your institutional affiliation. Are you Uganda Red Cross? Are you IFRC Asia? Are you not a Red Cross member who got the link and has joined? Please type in your chat window just for us to get a flavor of who is in this room. Are we 5 or are we 50 people? And that can help us make sense afterwards of how this conversation evolves over time. So first, again, thank you, David, for A, joining this conversation, and B, being such an engaged discussant about not only the atmospheric science side, but also how that links to many things, including the most vulnerable. One thing I'd like to highlight for those of you not yet familiar with this institutional landscape is that when I first joined this field, I heard several voices referring to the geoengineering clique, the small group of white men who are talking about controlling the planet's climate with the overtones of evil intentions. That's how I first got exposure to this. And of course, it made sense. If someone tells you that some other people are thinking of manipulating the climate, it is an understandable level of concern or paranoia. And now, as I increased my engagement and started learning from the individuals who were doing this, it became very clear to me that the motivations of David and many of his peers, like Ken Caldeira, like Doug Mack, many of these guys, they really have the intense desire to help the planet and to help the people in this planet, and have been very proactively reaching out and inviting and discussing and sharing and asking what questions we should ask. So I want to highlight also that David and others, unfortunately, have received essentially hate mail and threats. And yesterday, one of our colleagues, not David, was concerned about physical safety, the threat of people, bringing weapons. It has become this heated, and it's very important for us as humanitarians to ensure the civility and reasonable evidence-based conversation that follows. A few comments regarding David's question about my framing. Yes, I carry that baggage from the beginnings. My language continues to be a mix of deliberate and inadvertent. I think the analogy with nuclear weapons, I understand the overtones of negativity. It's to burn people alive. It's also to give a sense of scale, right? If I say a program, it has the same cost as the program on vaccine X, it's very different in terms of the understanding that some country could do it. As an analogy, I agree, geoengineering is not intended to cause damage to others. It is intended to deal with the harm. And in that sense, probably more than vaccines, which is a valid analogy, I just thought of using the analogy of chemotherapy. If someone is developing cancers, there's one organism that has something going wrong. We know that we can try to inject a new substance into that organism to try to undo that wrong, with the full understanding that other things may happen as well, and there may be side effects. And in extreme cases, that side effect could kill the patient or really make the patient suffer. Is that death different from the death caused by cancer? Maybe, maybe not. Is the suffering different? Maybe, maybe not. And as David says, without understanding research, science, and so on, it's hard to make sense. But we know we're confronting difficult choices. How language is used, there's been plenty of instances where my language has been, what is the role of the most vulnerable? What can happen about the most vulnerable? And then there's been very substantial cherry picking of my portrayals, starting with Asilomar, 7 years ago. And I've been not standing up in the public media denying what was cherry picked, because I couldn't deny that I said what I said. And I do not want to take a stance that is from my voice pro or anti geoengineering, because as a member of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, I should be neutral and impartial, at least given the current evidence. The final comment to say, in the beginning, I was of the idea that geoengineering most likely would only cause more harm. That was an uninformed position. My position now is that, as everyone knows, there are many things we don't know. Of what we know, many models, if not all models, show that given what we know, some damages resulting from climate change would be reduced. At the same time, things could happen that models don't capture. And that is the essence of our message. Can we anticipate what go wrong? And very importantly, as I see someone has asked, who takes responsibility for anticipating and managing potential unintended consequences? Of course, this should apply also to climate change without geoengineering. That's the problem. But here, because of the intended nature, that's a question we've been raising. How to deal with the role and the impacts of the most vulnerable. I'd like to pause here and invite Sean to raise any of the comments or questions sent by participants.
Thank you, Pablo. I appreciate that. And thank you also, Professor Keefe. It was extremely interesting. And I'd like to give Professor Keefe just a couple of minutes to respond to that as well, quickly, and then we'll open up to some questions from people who are listening in. We think we've got about 100 people listening in around the world, so coming in from different countries. So if you've got any questions, fire them through and we'll ask them of our speakers. But I'll hand it over first to Dr. Keefe just for some final words before we open up to questions. Thank you.
Sure. I guess just maybe to try and get a little quantitative. So thanks. And by the way, this back and forth with Pablo is really enjoyable and respectful. And to be clear, the stuff that Pablo mentioned, I think it's important to say about sort of threats of violence actually has sort of nothing to do with the, well, certainly not with the RC, Red Crescent humanitarian community, nor with people on the environmental left who oppose research, which is actually a pretty small number. But it's to do with people who believe in something called the chemtrails conspiracy, which is a whole separate but pretty isolated story, mostly people on the right side of the political spectrum. Maybe I'll say two things. One is just to be quantitative. Pablo said that originally he sort of assumed that most people would be harmed. Why he assumed that about a technology that reduces climate change, I don't understand. But then he said that now he views that might be that there would be some, I think he used the word some reduction, and so some benefits, but the question is what happens if people are made worse off? I think it's important to be quantitative. When we look at the suite of climate models, which may all be totally wrong, but are exactly the same climate models with the same uncertainty as we use to predict the risks of climate change, and we use a moderate amount of solar geo, essentially meaning more than 95% of the grid boxes and all countries, quite plausibly, everything at a national scale, I understand subnational matters a lot, see substantial reductions in say, extreme temperature events or extreme precip events. I mean, it's certainly not all, but it's important to say we're talking over 90%. I mean, it's very hard to think, in my experience with public policy on air pollution or other land use policies. We often think about sort of the economic term, the Pareto optimal, how much of a policy you do before one entity is made worse off, and thinking about the risks and benefits of all sorts of technologies and public policy decisions that societies make. At least from my point of view, looking at what appears to me the objective reality from these models that may be wrong, this is a pretty unusual in that it's actually pretty hard in the models to find areas that are made worse off if you do moderate solar geoengineering. I'm sure there will be some. And the second thing is also to maybe say a little bit about my perspective of how this dialogue is changing. I agree with Pablo. Things are changing pretty quickly. This used to be really a taboo topic, and the central reason for the taboo we haven't even brought up here. It's a concern that talking about this will reduce efforts to cut emissions. I think that's been the underlying reason, not actually concerns about risks. And things have changed pretty quickly. This new effort of Janos Pastors that launched formally yesterday, he was formerly the chief assistant for climate change to the Secretary General, is very important. There's also now research efforts in China, beginning to be research efforts in India and Philippines, significant research efforts in the European Union. The US National Academy has formally recommended there be research, and in the last days of the Obama administration, there was a formal recommendation for the US Global Change Research Program that there be research. And many of the sort of leading climate advocacy organizations have now switched to supporting research. So some of the major NGOs are now formally advocating research in solar geoengineering, although some are also formally suggesting there should be no research. Most are in the middle. And for example, one of our funders is the Hewlett Foundation, which is probably the strongest global funder of climate advocacy work. So that really is a big change from where it was sort of 5 years ago. Thanks.
Bring out a couple of the questions, although if there's any there that you see that you'd like to respond to, feel free to. But we have one of our colleagues asking, is it possible for geoengineering to be imagined or utilized on just a local or a regional scale without global impacts, without the big global spread? Is that sort of thing possible?
Part of this is a definitional thing. What's geoengineering? So a lot of definitions say that it's something where you're intentionally trying to alter the climate, where the intended and actual effects are at least at large or global scale. So altering your garden or putting lime in a lake to reduce acid rain is a deliberate alteration of nature, and in some cases a countervailing effect, but obviously not global in scale. So some of it depends on sort of definition of what geoengineering is. Two more comments. From public policy point of view, if it was possible for each region to kind of dial its own climate by some technological means, then from public policy point of view, it'd be easy. There'd be no hard public policy problem because each region would just decide its own climate. That's impossible. The climate is all interconnected by flows of moisture and heat. So we only really have one planet. There is some level at which you could adjust the climate, perhaps with geoengineering, to reduce the impacts of climate change, but you can't do it on a kind of small country-size basis without impacting countries nearby. From my view, the issue here, at least for me, is I'm trying to research ways to reduce the impacts of climate change, and those are pretty global, and we're trying to figure out ways to do that in a way which is as much as possible reducing the impacts of climate change everywhere.
If I may complement that, so again, definitionally, we think of geoengineering as the changing of the global climate system, and that is intended by David and others to have global and, to the extent possible, everyone local regional benefits. Of course, the system is what it is, and you could conceive of weather modification. It has already been done to have a better Olympics in Beijing. It could be done, for example, and indeed some research has happened in this, when a hurricane is approaching the US, it is theoretically possible to throw some magic powders on the hurricane to accelerate precipitation, so the hurricane loses its strength and its hurting capability before reaching the US. Of course, one consequence of that is that as it dumps rain before it reaches the US, it may rain much more than before in Guatemala or the Cayman Islands or Cuba. There's a full spectrum of things that could happen in between that are not this solar geoengineering, because that happens at the stratospheric level where everything gets dispersed across the planet. But there can be all sorts of consequences. One important thing that David and I mention regularly, and we didn't mention today, is that this approach will deal with atmospheric side of the consequences of climate change. It would not deal with something very important to, for example, our webinar participant from Trinidad and Tobago and the Philippines and so many others, which is the oceans are becoming more acidic because of the carbon entering the water. And what we're talking about would not be able to solve that problem. And I don't know what we're going to do about that, but you know, the chemical composition of the oceans and coral reefs and so on may decline. I want to highlight, if I got information correctly, we have participants from Geneva, Budapest, Boston, Spain, Colombia, the Philippines, Trinidad and Tobago. This is fantastic to see that the IFRC and its network has attracted this diverse group of people. Thank you. Any additional questions, Sean?
Yes, thank you. We do have participants from other places as well. Not everybody. Some people are a little bit gun shy on writing in, although not surprisingly. We did have an interesting question here about, you know, theoretically, where this technology and these research are applied, wouldn't it be possible then to extend the timeline for exploitation of fossil fuels? And if so, then, you know, to what extent are the fossil fuel industry involved in analysis of this kind of advancement, this kinds of research?
Great question. Pretty much not at all. So, for example, in raising philanthropic funds for our work at Harvard, we made a clear rule that we won't take any money from the fossil fuel industry or anybody associated with it, and effectively that will only take money from organizations involved in environmental and climate related causes. So I think that's a quite legitimate concern. There has been, I think, a very small involvement, some older involvement of people like Haroon Khashoggi at Exxon a decade ago. There's been some, and there have been some efforts in right-wing think tanks to advocate for solar geoengineering in a way that seems to be with exactly that perspective to keep fossil fuels around longer. My view is that in some ways these are deeply decoupled problems. So we're having a political fight about how quickly we cut emissions. I would personally like to cut them much quicker, and I've actually taken personal risks at the level of pretty much close to losing my job, certainly losing a significant part of it, in an oil town at University of Calgary, where I spoke out against the fossil fuel industry. So it's very personal for me. I'm very aware of the hard political fight around cutting emissions. There's no way it's ever going to be easy. I think there's signs that the community in the world that wants to cut emissions is gradually winning the fight, step by step. Clearly, the Trump administration is a step backwards. But I think the questions about how we do solar geoengineering are in practice largely decoupled. The CO2 emissions are this long, century-long cumulative story. And the question of whether or not it makes sense to do a gradual amount of solar geoengineering, those questions are more or less the same however quickly we cut CO2 emissions. It's important to say that even if we cut CO2 emissions to zero tomorrow, we would still have significant climate risk, and it might make sense to do moderate solar geoengineering even then, or it might not if it turns out that it doesn't work.
Yeah, in terms of that question, one thing that became very clear in the conversation yesterday in the launch of this new initiative is that what we know now is a fraction of what is knowable, and what we have been thinking that could be done now is a fraction of what is doable. We will be surprised not only by the physical or technological possibilities of doing geoengineering for good, but also in the very substantial complexities that manifest themselves not only in global atmospheric processes, but also in global geopolitical or regional or national or subnational conversations, expectations, ambitions. So hopefully this will, as David and Oliver Morton in The Planet Remade argue, this can be a force for good. We as humanitarians have a mandate to anticipate what can go wrong, and things could go wrong. And I do think that this is a personal opinion that is uninformed by science because there isn't enough research yet, but I do think that we should pay at least as much attention to the potential consequences of rainfall, temperature, extreme events as the like, as we should pay attention to how institutions, financial flows, politics, animosities may evolve as a result of the technical feasibility of geoengineering. So, humanitarian friends, the planet is changing. We have to rethink what we do. That's exactly the purpose of Sean's Future series and the Solferino Academy within the IFRC. It's fantastic that we're having this conversation. I'm sure that there are many questions unanswered and many questions yet to be formulated. One thing for you all to know is that there's a large group of researchers, from the most prominent like David to the most junior like some I met yesterday, who are really interested in helping shape our understanding and understanding of our options. So any questions you may have, myself and Jano and Martin and others would be happy to channel your concerns to the people who know how to answer questions, so that humanitarian concerns can be part of what goes on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pablo. I really appreciate your time today, and of course your expertise and your continuing commitment to helping us think better about the future and helping us understand some of the challenges facing us. David, would you like to finish with a couple of words before we wrap up?
Sure. Thank you very, very much. I think it's really appropriate the humanitarian community be involved here, because the direct impacts of climate change are one of the major challenges the humanitarian community has to manage. And I think getting sort of direct, specific understanding of those challenges and helping it shape the dialogue about how we manage climate risks is really important. from my point of view, in doing research on solar geoengineering, we need to be better directed in understanding how we might how it might be used to reduce risks and how it might increase risks. And I guess finally, I could not agree more with Pablo that a central focus for research on solar geoengineering has to be how it will go wrong. I think there's a long history of kind of technological hubris or over-optimism about the way technological interventions like this will work. And I think I've long argued that in structuring a research program, we need to have not one monolithic research effort, but mostly efforts that are devoted to figuring out the ways that this will go wrong, either technically or socially.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keefe. And once again, we're really grateful to be able to have somebody of your caliber here to spend some time with us explaining some of the intricacies of these developments as you understand them so well. And for being able to convert that in a language we can understand. Humanitarians sometimes have trouble following these things. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
We thank you both for your time this morning again, and we hope everybody listening to this enjoyed it. We will be having more of these throughout the year. Continue to look out for it and join in where you can. I should tell our speakers we've had a number of emails all day today and earlier in the week from people in Australia and New Zealand and Pacific Islands saying that they want to listen to this, but it's very early in the morning over there. So they've asked if we could record it and send it out to them. We will be doing that. So I will look out for that during the week. We'll be sending this recording out to everyone, and feel free to share it amongst the Red Cross Network. Thank you again to our speakers and to all of you who came along and joined in. Goodbye.
Thank you.